Welcome back. This is Module 2. Congratulations on finishing Module 1. What we're going to be learning in this module is the history of neurofeedback clinical practice. I think it is so important to learn this because unfortunately, most of us, whether we're in social work, psychology, or medicine, did not learn about the foundations or even peripherally about the practice of neurofeedback. In fact, I have a friend whose son is going to a prestigious university on the East Coast. He just completed his degree in neuroscience and knew very little about QEEG brain mapping and neurofeedback. So, without further ado, let's dive into the rich history of QEEG guided neurofeedback. What we're going to learn. We have 10 learning objectives. Number 1, who was the first person to identify neurophysiologic electrical activity in the brain? And what year was that? Number 2, who coined the term electroencephalogram? And what year did he publish his findings? Number 3, name 2 of the earliest psychologists to study brain-body connection. Number 4, who was the first person to demonstrate the ability to change brainwaves in humans? Number 5, who was the first person to publish data on a clinical application for changing brainwaves in humans? Number 6, whose research established that ADHD is a brain-based disorder? Number 7, who pioneered neurofeedback for the treatment of symptoms associated with traumatic brain injury, stroke, and cerebral palsy? Number 8, who was the first person to develop a normative database for comparing resting eyes closed EEG with age-matched controls? Number 9, who was the second person to develop a normative database for QEEG brain mapping? And number 10, who developed NeuroGuide QEEG normative database that contains both eyes open and eyes closed, phase, and coherence for age-matched controls? That's a lot, so let's get started. The first known neurophysiologic recordings of animals were performed by Richard Caton, MD, in 1874. He reportedly loved the classics and history and studied ancient Greek and Egyptian history, with a special emphasis in their medical practices. After graduating from school, he took a job at a bank, but shortly thereafter became ill. This piqued his interest in medicine. He then moved to Edinburgh to study medicine. He advocated for scientific research in medicine, which was novel for the time. In 1870, he was awarded a grant from the British Medical Association for the research of electrical activity of the brain. Using a Thomson reflecting galvanometer, he proved distinct variations in current between the sleeping and awake states in animals, which disappeared after their death. He published his results in the British Medical Journal in 1875. It took 15 years for his research to be replicated by other scientists across Europe. The advent of recording the electrical activity of human beings took another half-century to occur. Hans Berger, MD, a German psychiatrist, pioneered the EEG in humans in 1924. His life story is quite interesting. He originally was studying astronomy when he took a break and joined the cavalry. One day, on a training exercise, his horse balked and he fell right in the path of a horse-drawn carriage. He was, for obvious reasons, overwhelmed with terror and reported that his life flashed before his eyes. Thankfully, the driver of the carriage saw him and was able to stop his horses before they ran over him, and Hans Berger was able to crawl to safety. Hundreds of miles away, at the exact same time, his sister had an overwhelming sense that her brother's life was in danger. She asked her father to telegraph Hans to check on him. He reported this was the exact time to his sister. He believed this was a case of telepathy. Because of this experience, he returned to university and switched his studies to medicine with the goal of researching psychic energy of the brain. He graduated from medical school in 1897 and later became a chief psychiatrist. He began recording the brainwaves of dogs, and after serving as a military psychiatrist during World War I, he began recording from the service of human brains. In 1924, while experimenting on his son Klaus, he recorded the first electroencephalogram, a term which he coined. He finally published his data in 1929, where the alpha rhythm, 8 to 12 hertz, and the beta rhythm, 13 to 30 hertz, were described for the very first time. He even purported that the EEG reflected clinical disorders. The alpha rhythm is sometimes called the Berger rhythm, after Hans Berger. Like many discoveries, his research was met with skepticism and disbelief. In fact, he was openly mocked and seen as an oddball. It would be another 10 years before other researchers would replicate and confirm his findings. Unfortunately, when World War II began and the Nazis took power, they banned any further research on the EEG, and he was removed as the head of psychiatry and made a professor of psychology. Tragically, he took his own life in 1941, but he has left a remarkable legacy. Simultaneously, there were psychologists who began to investigate the influence of electricity in the skin in relation to psychological phenomena. One of the earliest publications involving the use of the galvanometer in research was published in 1890 by Jean, I might not pronounce this right, de Tarshanov in Russia, entitled Galvanic Phenomena in the Human Skin in Connection with Irritation of Sensory Organs and with Various Forms of Psychic Activity. It related emotional responses to stress and sensory stimuli as changes in the electrical properties of skin on a galvanometer. The name Tarshanov phenomenon was given to the effect. Most people think of Carl Jung as the father of analytical psychology. He wrote a lot about consciousness, self-acceptance, and looking within to heal oneself. However, he was also interested in the brain-body connection. In 1907, Carl Jung and his colleague Frederick Peterson published an article in the journal Brain based on their research in Zurich. They used the galvanometer with normal and abnormal individuals, measuring galvanic skin changes in reaction to word associations. Jung mentioned the research as early as 1906 in his paper titled Studies of Word Analysis, and you can still find this on the web today. Edgar Douglas Adrian was born in London in 1889. He attended Trinity College in Cambridge, where he studied physiology. He then went on to study medicine and specialized in neurology. ending back at Cambridge, where he lectured on the nervous system. While at Cambridge, he developed a technique to detect and amplify electrical signals from the brain using cathode ray tubes and a capillary electrometer. Adrian used his invention to record nerve impulses, and he published his findings in 1926. He used his invention to study the electricity in the human brain, contributing to the understanding of epilepsy and other brain-based disorders. However, the records were difficult to obtain and were distorted by the low frequency response of the instrument. Adrian's work not only showed the basic all or nothing nature of nerve signals, but also demonstrated the need for better instrumentation. Something was needed that, together with the necessary amplifiers, could detect individual impulses as small as a few tens of microvolts, and was fast enough to record at a few kilohertz, which could provide a permanent record. Adrian's student, Brian Harold Matthews, which you can see in the upper right here, developed a moving iron oscillograph with the necessary frequency response to drive this. He designed an amplifier. Records were obtained by reflecting a light beam from a small mirror on the moving part of the oscillograph onto paper. You can see a little picture here at the top. He also developed cameras to work with a light beam, which could be long and give large deflections for very small angular movements of the mirror. One of these was a moving paper camera to display patterns of impulses in time. Another had a rotating mirror, which enabled the shape of individual potential changes to be observed. They could now capture high gain, low noise recordings of brainwave activity. This model remained in use for over 2 decades. These two men were the first to replicate Hans Berger's work, using each other as subjects. In addition, they developed an entrainment system, which is a light flickering system to stimulate the alpha rhythm at the same frequency of the flickering light. This demonstrated for the first time that brainwaves could be modified, in this case by flickering lights. It was not neurofeedback because it is one way, but still a very important discovery. Edgar Douglas Adrian received a Nobel Prize for his work in 1932. He eventually rose to become the Chancellor of the University of Cambridge. He passed away in 1977. In the 1950s, scientists believed that humans had no control over the autonomic nervous system. In fact, it was called the involuntary nervous system for a very long time, which some people still use today. However, Neil Miller, PhD, was a prolific experimental psychologist, and he proved otherwise. Dr. Miller received his bachelor's degree in biology and physics from the University of Washington, where his father was a professor and chair of the Department of Education and Psychology. He went on to Stanford for his MA in behavioral psychology, and then to Yale, where he received his PhD in 1935. As I mentioned, he was a prolific researcher and authored over 275 papers and 8 books. One of his biggest contributions was his body of research demonstrating the ability of humans to alter autonomic nervous system function via operant conditioning by 1960. Therefore, biological processes such as heart rate, blood pressure, and skin temperature could be altered given appropriate feedback to the subject. He received the National Medal of Science from President Lyndon B. Johnson and several awards from the American Psychological Association, including the APA citation for outstanding lifetime contribution to psychology in 1991. His contributions became the foundation for neurofeedback. One of the earliest researchers in biofeedback was John Basamajan, MD, a physician who was born in Istanbul of Armenian descent and raised in Canada. He also used an oscilloscope to obtain real-time readings of the electrical activity of muscles. He performed studies using fine wire electromyography instruments to demonstrate that humans could control muscles down to the single motor unit level, controlled by a single motor neuron. His research was the foundation of the widely used EMG biofeedback called surface EMG or SMEG. Dr. Basamjian wrote the first book on biofeedback. The biofeedback techniques he developed continue to be used today to help people with physical disabilities and neurological disorders. For the physicians in this group, ask your OB-GYN and urology colleagues about pelvic floor EMG. All the large centers have technicians trained in SEMG. In 1991, he was awarded the Order of Ontario. Even though he was not a prolific writer, most people regard this man, Joseph Kamiya, PhD, as the father of neurofeedback. He was born in Sacramento, California in 1926 and reportedly grew up on a chicken farm. Because of his Japanese ancestry, he and his family were interned on Angel Island in San Francisco in 1942 during World War II. Bob Gurney met Dr. Kamiya and said he was a very kind and humble man. When hearing about his internment, Bob said, "He must have been very forgiving too, because you never would have known it." This experience likely influenced his decision to study philosophy, social welfare, and psychology at the University of California, Berkeley for his bachelor's degree. He graduated in 1948 and then went on to receive his PhD in psychology in 1954 from the same institution. His first position was at the University of Chicago, where he met Dr. Nathaniel Kleitman, who ran a sleep lab. He took Dr. Kamiya under his wing as he was nearing retirement. Dr. Kamiya began research in the sleep lab, learning about EEG and sleep states. Eventually, he moved back to California, taking a position at the University of California, San Francisco. It was there that sleep researchers first came together with Dr. Kamiya as the head of what eventually became the Association for the Psychophysiological Study of Sleep, APSS. Dr. Kamiya befriended many other researchers and became interested to see if conscious recognition of brainwaves was possible. He decided to train volunteers to recognize bursts of alpha activity by giving them verbal reinforcement every time they entered into an alpha state. His experiment was a success. He presented his findings at meetings and by word of mouth. This was the first demonstration of EEG-guided neurobiofeedback. This is the premise of all forms of biofeedback. An instrument records the biological activity of interest, whether it's heart rate, blood pressure, or brain waves, and the trainee is reinforced every time the biological activity moves in the direction of interest. Voluntary control of that activity is mastered. Around the same time, Dr. Barry Sterman was studying the electrical activity of the brain in cats. According to Bob Gurney, who has known Dr. Sterman professionally for many years, Dr. Sterman was studying sleep spindles in cats when one of his colleagues lost funding and they had to shut down the lab at night. Dr. Sterman was very frustrated, and the thought occurred to him that he might be able to train the cats to make sleep spindles during the day. His next thought immediately was, wait, everybody knows you can't change brain waves, and even if you could, they would go right back. And that is still what most physicians believe today, unfortunately. But he apparently is a skeptic and decided to research the data on this. And to his surprise, after checking the sources and the sources of the sources, he found that no one had actually done the research. Some German neurologist decades ago made this statement, and everyone took that as gospel truth. So he decided to do the study that would either confirm or deny the theory. He spoke to all of his cat research buddies to find out what the most potent reward for cats might be, and he found that it is chicken broth mixed with milk. He conducted a Pavlovian type experiment with 10 cats where they pressed a lever and received 6 drops of chicken broth mixed with milk. Then he introduced a tone with the lever. He then altered the experiment to make it so that they could not press the lever until the tone ended. He was watching their brainwaves during the training. He noticed that the cat's theta waves went down. Now remember, those are drowsy waves. And a certain type of beta wave, low beta or SMR, went up. He then rewarded the cats when they replicated this brainwave pattern. The cats began making huge, long stretches of SMR while bringing their theta down. And voila, he proved that brainwaves can be changed. He had his paper. 8 months later, NASA contacted him because their astronauts were having seizures. They were fairly certain that the seizures were from exposure from rocket fuel, but they wanted him to do an experiment to substantiate their hunch. They hooked up 30 cats this time to begin the experiment. To his surprise, the 10 cats who had been in the prior experiment were still making huge long stretches of SMR waves and had low theta. Even more surprising was the fact that every cat seized upon exposure to the rocket's fuel except those 10 cats. You might imagine what he did next. He marched right over to the Department of Neurology and asked for all the patients who were non-responders to anti-seizure medications. He then trained theta down and SMR up in those volunteers, and guess what? Their seizures significantly reduced or completely went away. In follow-up, about 1/3 of the patients reported a side effect. If they were in school, their grades went up, and if they were in the workforce, their productivity and performance skyrocketed. Further investigation revealed that these individuals had the diagnosis of ADHD, and their symptoms had dramatically improved. Neurofeedback was born. Joel Lubar, PhD, received his BS and PhD both from the University of Chicago. He was one of the key individuals largely responsible for researching and developing the use of EEG biofeedback, now known as neurofeedback, as a treatment modality for children, adolescents, and adults with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, starting with his controlled studies in the mid-1970s. He has published over 85 papers, many chapters, and 8 books in the areas of neuroscience and applied psychophysiology. He was a professor at the University of Rochester for some years and is now a full professor at the University of Tennessee. His research made it clear that ADHD was not just a behavioral disorder, but a brain disorder. Today, neurofeedback for the treatment of ADHD has been studied to the point that it is labeled as a level 5 evidence-based treatment. In fact, because of his research, neurofeedback is endorsed by the American Academy of Pediatrics as a treatment as effective as medications for ADHD. Alice and Elmer Green and their colleague Dale Walters of the Menninger Foundation, as well as Thomas Budzinski, were key in joining physiology and psychotherapy to birth a new field, psychophysiology. They called their new training autogenic feedback training. These individuals were very interested in replicating the meditative states of Indian yogis and found that early meditative states were marked with a dominance of alpha, and deeper meditative states were marked with a theta prominence. They pioneered theta enhancement training. They combined psychotherapy with other forms of biofeedback, such as thermal biofeedback, to enhance relaxation as well. Another pioneer in neurofeedback was Margaret Ayres, PhD. She was a former employee of Barry Sturman. Margaret Ayres left his practice to open the very first private practice for neurofeedback. Her area of interest and focus was traumatic brain injury, including stroke, cerebral palsy, in addition to other disorders such as learning disabilities, autism, and coma. She was the first to use inhibition protocols. She found that individuals with head trauma and other psychological disorders, the brain was producing theta, 4 to 7 hertz frequencies in the area of damage in phasic spikes or continuously. Individuals were trained to inhibit one frequency and following inhibition produce 15 to 18 hertz. She was also the first to teach others to rely on neurophysiology to determine the electrode site placement. She was the first to recognize and teach the information found in the morphology of the EEG using raw brainwave patterns. She firmly believed that the brain has the capacity to heal and restore itself. I encourage you to read her 2004 article on the use of neurofeedback for cerebral palsy in the Journal of Neurotherapy. She developed software, neuropathways, that displays raw waveform activity back to the client so that changes could be seen directly on the computer screen. She also wrote a book shown here called Whispers in the Brain, detailing the morphology of brain waves. One of the very first databases developed for QEEG neurofeedback was developed by this man, E. Roy John, PhD, while he was at the New York University Medical School. His database is called NX-Link. Dr. John was born in Brownsville, Pennsylvania during the Great Depression. He fought in the Battle of Bulge in World War II, then returned to college, obtaining his BS in physics and his PhD in psychology from the University of Chicago. He worked at the University of Rochester, where he founded the Brain Research Laboratory. During his lifetime, he also worked on the Manhattan Project, making plutonium. Apparently, in Cuba, where he vacationed and traveled frequently, he is considered the grandfather of Cuban neuroscience. He was also an avid lover of boating. Around the world, Dr. John is credited with inventing the field of neurometrics, the analysis of brain function by measuring the brain's electrical activity. Dr. John was committed to translating his discoveries in basic science into clinical practice, leading to improved treatment of neurocognitive and psychiatric disorders. His work led to more than 25 patents in medical technology, implemented through continuous collaborations with his medical colleagues. Medical instruments based on neurometric technology can also be found in anesthesiology. One example is a QEEG algorithm for monitoring patients' brainwaves while they are in the operating room. And that is now used in almost every United States operating room today for prolonged surgeries. It's used to detect if the patient is receiving too much or too little anesthesia. In fact, one of his own devices was reportedly used on him later in life when he had open heart surgery. The second individual to create a normative database was Dr. Frank Duffy, MD, at Harvard Medical School. And an interesting fact when I learned while researching, actually searching for a picture of Dr. Duffy, which was hard to come by, that I learned that he competed in eventing in the 1956 Olympics in Stockholm, which makes him even nearer and dearer to my heart as a fellow pediatrician, because he's a pediatric neurologist, and pediatric neurologists must first do a pediatric residency, and a fellow horse lover. So at the time, he was a student at the University of Michigan. He received his undergraduate degree in electrical engineering and mathematics. After college, he attended Harvard Medical School and obtained his medical degree in 1963. He did his residency in neurology at Boston Children's Hospital and neurosurgery at Massachusetts General at the Leahy Clinic, followed by a fellowship at Yale New Haven Hospital. His research interests are in neurodevelopmental disorders, such as autism, and epilepsy, including the development and utilization of specialized analytic techniques to support related investigations. Thus, he is a world-renowned pediatric neurologist who has practiced in Boston for over 50 years. He's authored over 200 papers in his lifetime. Unfortunately, his QEEG database is not for sale, but is mainly used for research purposes at his institution. He did author the book, Topographic Mapping of Brain Electrical Activity, which is available on several used book sites, book sale websites. He is often quoted as saying, "The literature, which lacks any negative study of substance, suggests that EBT, EEG biofeedback therapy or neurofeedback, should play a major therapeutic role in many difficult areas. In my opinion, if any medication had demonstrated such a wide spectrum of efficacy, it would be universally accepted and widely used. It is a field to be taken seriously by all." That was a statement published in this journal you can see on the right, Clinical EEG, back in the year 2000. And finally, this is Robert Thatcher, PhD. He produced NeuroGuide, what is now known as NeuroGuide, a database, back in 1979, while he was the principal investigator of a project to correlate nutrition and environmental toxins on human brain development. He gathered over 1,350 EEG recordings, and from this population, approximately 620 were healthy, normal control subjects, based on neuropsychological and neurological questionnaires and interviews. This is the same reference database used for his NeuroGuide, but over the last several years, more adults and children have been screened and added to the reference database, so that the total sample size is 727 and spans the age range from 2 months to 82 years. Because of its 25-year history and the number of replications and cross-validations, it is considered as accepted science and has been used in hundreds of research studies today. It is also used by the National Institute of Health, the Department of Defense, and VA medical centers across the United States. finally, if you desire to do more reading on the history of EEGs, QEEG brain mapping, and neurofeedback, I would recommend these websites and this book, Neurofeedback, The First 50 Years. The brain site in the center is brainclinics.com, run by another giant in neurofeedback, Martin Arns. And there is a section called Pioneers of the EEG that is fun and informative. All right, here are some references. Again, you will get a handout with all of my references at the end, and feel free to do a deep dive into these as well as the other websites that have been given for you. Thank you so much for joining us for Module 2. Next up is the quiz.